All right. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for organizing the symposium and inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure for me to attend OHBM in Seoul, where I was born and raised, and I hope you all enjoy this exciting and vibrant city. And some of you may have already spent the day sightseeing in Seoul, and your memories are likely be organized into distinct events like this, like visiting Gyeongbokgung Palace, shopping for souvenirs in Insadong, and having a nice Korean BBQ dinner, and so on. But if you think about it, time always flows continuously. Then why do we remember these chunks of events instead of one whole continuous day? And this question has intrigued many researchers, and a lot of studies have shown that we perceive boundaries in continuous experiences, and these boundaries shape the way we remember our past. And according to a prominent theory on event segmentation, we constantly make predictions about what's happening around us, and a boundary occurs when there is a mismatch between our prediction and incoming sensory input, like when a random stray cat interrupts your walk. And this mismatch also produces transient brain responses, such as increased activation in the hippocampus. But boundaries may also occur endogenously. So let's say when we recall your day in Seoul, our mind travels from one event to another. And in this case, there is not really external sensory input violating our predictions. And the boundaries are internally generated by ourselves. So our question was, what are the neural signatures of these internally driven endogenous event boundaries? Are they the same as externally driven event boundaries? So today, I'm going to very briefly introduce 3 studies that examine neural responses at endogenous event boundaries using naturalistic tasks. So first, we examined neural responses at event boundaries during continuous narrative recall. So in this study, published in 2022, subjects first watched a series of short movies, and there were 10 movies. And then they verbally described the movies, recalled the movies in any order they wanted. And our approach was to measure brain responses at the boundaries between movies during recall and test whether they were comparable to the responses at the boundaries during encoding, where there were actual changes in the external stimuli. So we started by examining whether the boundaries between movies produce any changes in activation during movie watching. So here you see the whole brain activation map up there, and then time courses from 2 regions, the posterior medial cortex and the auditory cortex, and the responses are locked to the offset of each movie. And consistent with prior findings, we found some transient responses in multiple cortical regions. And likewise, we observed some responses at the internally driven boundaries during recall, although the responses were a little weaker than during encoding. But how do we directly compare these responses? So how do we know how similar these boundary responses are and in which brain areas? So we performed the pattern similarity analysis to test whether the brain activation patterns at boundaries generalize across movie watching and recall. For each brain area, we took the activation patterns at the offset of each movie, and then computed correlations between these boundary patterns across encoding and recall, and note that the patterns were also correlated across different movies, and this was to rule out the effect of shared movie stimuli. And for comparison, we computed the correlations between non-boundary patterns, and the non-boundary patterns were defined as the middle segment of each movie. And these were the regions that showed higher pattern similarity for boundary compared to non-boundary periods, and they are mostly higher associative cortices within and around the default mode network. So we took a closer look at the posterior medial cortex, which showed the highest, strongest effect. And here I show pattern similar matrices computed across different movies, boundary and non-boundary conditions, and experimental phases, basically encoding and recall. And here's a pattern similarity during the encoding phase. So each row and column of this matrix is an individual movie. And you can see that all boundary patterns were very, very similar to each other regardless of the specific movies. But this wasn't the case for non-boundary patterns. And at the internally driven boundaries during recall, the activation patterns were again highly similar across different movies. And critically, the boundary patterns were similar across encoding and recall. And that is, when there was a major transition between mental context, this region, the posterior medial cortex, showed highly similar activation patterns regardless of the task or stimulus. And individual subjects' activation pattern maps clearly show the similarity between encoding and recall boundary patterns. So the boundary pattern may reflect whatever that is, a general cognitive state, but one remaining question is whether it generalizes across different levels or scales. So for example, in this study, we looked at major boundaries between completely different narratives, but boundaries can also be detected between different movie scenes or even different actions within a scene. And earlier studies on event segmentation mostly focused on these minor boundaries within the same scene or a movie. Then is the general boundary pattern that we observed simply a stronger version of these minor boundary responses, or is it something qualitatively different? So to answer this question, we directly compare the major and minor boundary patterns. So we first compute the mean PMC activation pattern of minor within movie boundaries during encoding, and also compute the mean pattern of major between movie boundaries during recall. And it turns out that the boundary patterns were not similar to each other. And this contrasts with this very strong positive correlation between major boundary patterns during encoding and recall. So the cognitive state associated with these major boundaries is qualitatively different from the state associated with minor boundaries within the same context. So that was the first study. So here we show that internally driven boundaries between memories create brain activation patterns similar to those observed in externally driven boundaries, especially when the boundaries are between completely different narratives. And in the second study, we extended this finding to transitions between spontaneously generated thoughts. So we tested basically whether the internally driven boundary responses appear at any kind of major mental context transitions rather than solely between narrative recalls. So we used the think-aloud method with fMRI. So subjects basically said out loud whatever thoughts came to their mind for 10 minutes. So they're basically describing their stream of consciousness. And this is an example subject think-aloud recording. I don't see the audio, so I just skip through it. So this person just began by describing his current sensation, then switched to what he could have for lunch, and also describe some general semantic knowledge. And to identify boundaries between these thoughts, we manually segmented the think-aloud responses based on changes in thought categories such as current sensation, future thinking, semantic knowledge, episode recall, and so on. And we also segmented different topics within each category. And then we used these individual segments as units of thought for analysis. And additionally, we measure the strength of thought boundaries by having a separate group of coders identify the moments when one thought transitions to another. And the boundary strength or agreement score was defined as the proportion of coders who identified a given moment as a boundary. Oops. Wait. Okay. So first, we found that boundary agreement was much higher at topic boundaries compared to the thought category boundaries, suggesting that topics or semantic contexts are important in the segmentation of thoughts. And consistent with this idea, the boundary agreement was negatively correlated with the semantic similarity between consecutive thoughts. And the semantic similarity was measured by a natural language processing technique. And as in the first study, multiple brain regions showed higher, some transient responses at thought boundaries. So here you see the responses at the posterior medial cortex, and you can see that the response magnitude scaled with boundary agreement scores. And what about the distributed activation patterns? So we observe the same boundary pattern at strong thought boundaries. So we took the between movie boundary pattern from the movie watching phase of the first study, and then correlated it with the activation pattern at the strongest thought boundaries, basically boundaries with the agreement score of 1. And for comparison, we also correlated the movie boundary pattern from the first study and the non-boundary pattern from the think-aloud study. And the strong thought boundary pattern was similar to the movie boundary pattern, again in higher order cortices, including the posterior medial cortex. And these correlations were greater than those with the non-boundary pattern. And consistent with the first study, the strong thought boundary pattern was distinct from the minor within movie boundary pattern. So actually the within movie boundary pattern was somewhat similar to the non-boundary pattern in areas near the posterior medial cortex. So we found the generalized activation pattern at major internally driven boundaries that was also similar to externally driven major boundary patterns. But what does it mean anyway? What cognitive processes does this reflect? Well, we don't really know for sure, but we can find some hints by looking at the whole brain activation map at major boundaries. So these maps show activation as strong thought boundaries during think-aloud, and between movie boundaries during movie watching and recall. And these activation patterns are somewhat similar to so-called the frontoparietal control network, especially around the posterior medial cortex. So one possibility is that the relative activation of the frontoparietal control network was behind this consistent boundary pattern in the posterior medial areas, because the frontoparietal control network is adjacent to the default mode network and actually interdigitated with the default mode network. And again, the control network is typically activated during task switching, so this pattern may indicate the cognitive control demands associated with mental context switching, like resolving conflicts between competing thoughts. But this idea is, of course, based on reverse inference, so it should be approached with caution. So in the third study, we examined neural responses during voluntary task switching, and we compared them with the major boundary responses from our earlier studies. So this was an fMRI study, and subjects continuously browse the web while switching between different tasks. So in this example video, the person first looked for some items like hairpins on Amazon and then switched to finding a restaurant in Yelp. And once again, we compute the mean pattern, mean activation pattern at the major boundaries from the first study, and then correlated with the activation patterns measured at each moment around the task boundaries during web browsing. And we observed the same major boundary pattern in the posterior medial cortex. So the pattern appeared a few seconds before the beginning of a new task. So it's likely that this is reflecting the selection process leading to the eventual task switching. So here are some take-home points, especially for those who study event segmentation. So first, event boundaries can be generated internally without any changes in external stimuli. So we showed that internally generated event boundaries evoked neural responses similar to externally generated boundaries, especially in higher order cortices, including the posterior medial cortex. And not all event boundaries are equal. So different levels of boundaries, like major boundaries between completely different mental contexts and minor boundaries within the same context, can engage distinct cognitive and neural processes. And finally, the consistent cortical responses and major boundaries may reflect some increased cognitive control demands associated with mental context switching, but more research is needed to fully understand their nature. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I thank my colleagues and collaborators at Purdue and Johns Hopkins University, and especially I thank Yoonjung Lee for collecting fMRI data for the third study. And a quick advertisement, we are recruiting a PhD student for my lab for fall 2025, so if anyone is interested, feel free to email me. Thank you.